In round 4 of the Superbet Chess Classic, we saw a great battle between the youngsters. So 19-year-old Alireza Firouzja with black playing against Bogdan-Daniel Deac with the white pieces. Now keep your eye on Deac's clock because he is a time trouble addict. Really reminds me of Grischuk. So let's see what happened. Pawn d4 played by Deac. Alireza goes d5, we get knight f3, knight f6, c4, and now c6, the Slav defense elected for by Alireza. So e3 now played, and it does leave this bishop at home inside the pawn chain, but very often white's looking to go e4 later on, and you then liberate that piece. We get bishop f5, knight c3, and e6 now sets up the classic pawn triangle, and there's a ton of theory that starts with knight to h4. I covered a Gukesh game the other day actually in this line. He was playing black against Jordan van Forest. Really great game. I'll link that one at the end in case you missed it. So we see bishop e2 now played. Now in a moment we see that bishop go to d3. So it begs the question, why doesn't it get played sooner? And I'm not entirely sure. I mean, we now get h6, so it gives that bishop here a retreat square. We get castles, knight bd7, and now bishop d3. So maybe delaying this, waiting for the development of the knight is slightly superior. Okay, too subtle for me. But we see an exchange. The queen recaptures, and now Alireza goes for bishop to b4. He could have gone bishop e7 there. That would allow white to then go pawn e4 though, and so this is what this move was playing against. You can't now go e4 in one go. So bishop d2 breaks the pin, and now Alireza drops back this bishop to a5, for the reason being that it's now defended by the queen. So you can't play this tactic of takes on d5, taking advantage of the bishop. Now you're going to see what I'm talking about in a moment, because Deac now plays pawn to b4, trying to set up the same tactic. So if Alireza had taken, then there's this knight d5 shot, and if you take on d2, we capture on f6 with check first, intermezzo or Zwischenzug, call it what you will. Then you take back the bishop, and okay, you've restored the material, or actually you've restored the material, but slightly better game for white. And alternatively, coming back here, if you don't take on d2, if you capture this one, well then you lose the bishop, it's hanging. This is the point of the tactic. So Alireza doesn't capture the pawn, he drops the bishop back, and now here Deac gets ambitious. So he could go pawn to e4 here, and you're just kind of starting to liquidate things basically. The knight's coming to f6 and that sort of thing. It's looking fairly stable and drawish. But what we see instead is pawn to b5. And this is a bit more ambitious, as we'll see. So Alireza, he goes knight b4, taking advantage of the fact that this c4 square is now sensitive, and there's not such a great way for white to meet this move. Because if you go pawn c5, well then the knight hops to c4, and that's just this monster outpost. It can't be challenged by a light squared bishop. Okay, you can challenge with a knight at some point, but that knight is clearly better than this bishop. So c5 not played, and equally if you capture, pawn recaptures, again it gives this option of knight c4, or if you ever go e4, you can now take like this, and the knight can get a square on d5, no pawn on c4. So neither of those moves played, c5 or captures. We see takes on c6, but not the routine recapture now, but Alireza takes on c4. The queen drops back, and now he takes on c6. So he's actually a pawn up here, and it's white that's trying to equalise really. So it's gone a bit wrong in the opening for Deac. So knight a4 now played, immediately opening the queen to attack this pawn. And you don't want to take, queen recaptures. Now this pawn's looking sensitive, good pawn structure for white. So instead, we see castles, and if you try and chop this knight, immediately win this pawn, well the problem is that black's now opened the A file, and this is just slightly better for black. There's not much in it. You can bring the rook here, then you can tactically defend the pawn like this. There's bishop takes here, check ideas, and if king f1, the bishop moves, all this sort of stuff going on. There's not much in it for black, but the computer gives it slightly better. So we didn't see Deac immediately try and win the pawn back. Instead, he brings the rook. we see queen d5, bishop b4, the rook slides to the open file, at least open in terms of no pawns, and now knight b2. So this is Deac's idea. He wants to win the pawn back with the knight. But Alireza now finds a great sequence. So he goes a5, kicks this bishop, and then pawn c3. So the pawn was going to drop anyway. He wants to give it back on his terms, because if you capture like this, well, Alireza can then win the a2 pawn, and that is a safe pawn to grab. You know, you sometimes have to be careful of getting your queen trapped, but okay, it's always got an escape route. So that's why we didn't see the queen capture this pawn. Instead, knight d3 was played, heading for c5, and now knight e4 from Alireza. He hops in and defends this pawn. Knight c5 challenges the knight on e4, twice with the queen, and again, no routine capture. Instead, knight d2 is played. Best move. So you have to give back this pawn at some point, and this is the best sequence to do it in when you run it with the engine. And you can immediately follow up with knight c4, pick up this bishop. That's the top move. But Alireza goes for e5, looking to shake things up, and e4 now comes. Not an easy move to spot from afar. Now Alireza does not take on d4, for the reason being that now the queen's come off the board, and this is just very, very level, very drawish. You know, if you try and defend this pawn, well then the knight can even hop to b7 and force a repetition. If you come to d7, we come back, something like this, and if you ever slide away, well okay, then the pawn just drops and there's just not much to be said. So what does Alireza do? Drop the queen back, because now you cannot win the pawn immediately or you lose your queen. And so we see the rook coming to the d file. Now this is a threat, but Alireza can take with the pawn, keep the queens on the board. So Deac recaptures with the queen. And now again, classic Alireza style. He doesn't just swap the queens, very routine, boring looking draw on the way. He goes bishop f4, pressuring this rook. And now if you swap the queens, well, this is just a bit better for black. You know, something like this could come, the rook's attacked, it can slide away, but knight c4, there's just uncomfortable pressure on these pieces. You can even keep the bishops on the board, and we can just see that all of the black pieces are superior, except maybe these two knights you could say are equal, right? So better endgame for black if you exchange queens. Now queen c3 would have been a strong move here. You open the attack here, and after queen g5, best move, rook b1 can come, and white's doing okay, not too bad. But what we see in the game is rook c2, and it just sets up these tactical shots which Alireza is so astute to. So he brings the queen into g5. And to give you one sample of the tactics here, well, okay, actually, let me first say there's a threat to go rook d8 and pick up this loose rook here once the queen moves. So if you now go queen c3 to dodge that threat, well, this time you're walking into check, king takes, and check, picking up the loose rook on d1. You know, just the flavour of things here. So that's why this rook moves to f1, best move and a good find on low time. We now see rook d8 anyway, queen c3 and queen h5, trains on the h2 pawn. And Deac uses a lot of time now figuring out whether to go h3 or g3. He goes pawn to g3, the bishop drops back to e5, hits the queen, it slides over, hits Alireza's knight, and Alireza backpedals it to c8. Now it looks a bit passive, but it has cleared the b file for this rook to activate. And Deac now goes bishop to c1, seeking to re-maneuver this bishop, but look at his time, he's now playing on the 30-second increment. Rook b8 from Alireza, and here Deac, he finds an imprecise move. So queen c4 is best. He goes queen a4. I mean, I won't get into all the subtleties of why that's best. There's not tons in it. But this now allows Alireza to go rook b5. Again, I don't want to go down that whole line. Computer gives a small edge for black. Alireza, however, goes rook d1. And this is a great practical move. Really tricky and tactical. Now, the best move for white, which wasn't played, is to capture that rook. But it just doesn't look good at all, because the queen invades with check, the king moves, and then you can go rook b4. And it looks like you're just dropping an entire rook, because, whoops, because you're hitting the queen. If it comes back to b3, obviously it gets taken, so it would have to move away, but then it looks like you're just losing an entire rook. But the trick in this line is that you take the knight with check, and then you can check from f5. Really nice geometry. And then you can pick up the bishop. Well, okay, after blocks, pick up the bishop. Black can take here, and then you've even got this fork. So it's actually black now trying to make the draw. Long line, but that's the reason why you could actually take on d1. But what Deac does, it's not so human to find all of that stuff. With 30 seconds on the clock, he goes rook d2, trying to get rid of that piece. He's now attacking it twice like this, and he was probably looking at takes, bishop recaptures. He just forgot about rook takes on f1, or maybe he just overlooked the danger of dropping the h2 pawn. Now Alireza doesn't take straight away. He flicks in knight to b6. I mean, he sheds a pawn in the process of this, but now he takes on h2, and this is such a dangerous attack. So knight d3 is played, hits the undefended bishop, but queen h1 check, the king moves, and bishop d4. What an amazing centralized piece. So there's big problems for the white monarch, and the queen can't activate because it's glued to the defense of this pawn. If you move, it's dropping with check. So that's why rook d1, trying to evict this queen, but now it checks from h5, we get king e1, rook c8, attacks that queen. There's no takes on b6, of course. It's defended by that amazing wooden shield, as Hikari would say, right? And now queen b7 was met by queen f3 and forced resignation. All of the white pieces are just tied down, basically. There's so many tactics. The top line of the engine is bishop b2, but then it walks into this tactic. It's -5 at this point, and it distracts the knight so that you can then invade with this rook, hit the bishop, and threaten checkmate. Now this is the best line for white to stave off the mate, but then you can check from e3, the king goes, you take the rook, and okay, you're literally an exchange ahead. Still a massive attack, threatening mate. This is the only way to defend it, but okay, then you drop another piece and the attack rages on. Just a sample line. So Alireza, he beats Deac. Great game from him. And if you want to see a game in a similar line played by DEACtivates, then check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.